Imagine waking up on a cold winter morning and your heater isn't working. You go to the kitchen, turn on the stove, nothing. You think it's just a power outage, but then you check the news and realize this isn't an outage. This is the new reality for 450 million Europeans. The gas is gone. Not because it doesn't exist in the ground, but because politicians decided it would be better this way. The European Union just made the decision to completely cut off Russian gas imports. Not reduce, not decrease, completely eliminate. The pipelines that have supplied European industry and heated European homes for decades are now being shut down one by one. And you know what's the scariest part? The reserves stored in underground facilities will last maybe 3 to 4 months at most. After that, nothing. This isn't some conspiracy theory or internet horror story. This is official data from the European Union itself. Gas storage facilities are currently filled to 80% capacity, which sounds pretty good, right? But here's what they're not telling you. These reserves are calculated for normal consumption with continuous supply coming in. When supply stops completely, that 80% evaporates in a single heating season. And then there's silence. Right now, I'm going to tell you what's really happening behind closed doors in European governments, what numbers they're hiding from ordinary people, and why a decision being presented as a victory of principles might become the most expensive economic suicide in modern history. Let's start with numbers that most people simply don't understand. The European Union, until recently, imported 40% of all its gas from Russia. 40% isn't just a statistic. It's billions of cubic meters of natural gas that flowed through pipelines every single day, powering factories, electrical plants, and heating systems. 40% is the difference between a functioning economy and total collapse. Now, EU representatives say, we found alternatives. We signed contracts for liquefied natural gas from America, from Qatar, from Norway. We're ready. But here's the problem. Liquefied natural gas costs 3 to 4 times more than pipeline gas. This isn't trivial. It means every kilowatt of electricity, every ton of steel produced, every chemical product automatically becomes 3 to 4 times more expensive. And who do these costs get passed on to? Ordinary people. Look at what's already happening in Germany, Europe's largest economy, an industrial powerhouse that built its prosperity on cheap energy and high-tech manufacturing. BASF, one of the world's largest chemical giants, has already announced the closure of several plants in Germany. Not production cuts, closures, permanent shutdowns, thousands of jobs disappearing. And this is just the beginning. The automotive industry, which has always been Germany's pride, is now suffocating. Aluminum production requires massive amounts of energy. Plastic production requires energy. Glass production requires energy. When energy becomes prohibitively expensive, production stops. Factories can't operate at a loss. They shut down and move production to where energy is still affordable, to China, to India, to America. Italy has already faced a wave of bankruptcies among small and medium businesses. Bakeries that operated for centuries are closing because they can't pay their gas bills. Ceramic factories, textile manufacturers, small metallurgical plants, they all operated on thin margins, and the sharp rise in energy prices delivered a fatal blow. This isn't abstract economics. These are real people losing their income, unable to pay their mortgages, unable to feed their families. And this is only the first wave. The real catastrophe will begin in winter when gas demand skyrockets while supply remains limited. Electricity prices are already breaking records, and the heating season hasn't even really started yet. What happens when temperatures drop to 10-15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit? When every family turns on their heaters, when every business fights for every cubic meter of gas? European governments say, we'll introduce subsidies, we'll support the population, we won't let people freeze. But let's do the math. Germany has already allocated 200 billion euros to support energy consumers. 200 billion. That's more than the entire annual budget for education and healthcare combined. France allocated 100 billion. Italy, Spain, Poland, they're all printing money and throwing it around left and right, trying to plug holes in their budgets. And what happens when governments print such volumes of money? That's right, inflation. Prices rise on everything: food, clothing, transportation. Your salary stays the same, but it buys less and less. This is a hidden tax on everyone earning income in euros. Your savings lose value every day, while politicians try to save the economy by drowning it even deeper. Now, let's move to the second part. Let's talk about what the phrase deindustrialization of Europe actually means. This isn't just a fancy word from the news. This is a process we're observing right now in real time. And the consequences of this process will be felt for decades. Industry isn't just factories and smokestacks. It's the foundation of any developed country's economy. It's jobs for millions of people. It's exports that bring currency into the country. It's technology that drives progress forward. When industry dies, everything else dies with it. First factories close, then workers get laid off, then cities empty out, then social systems collapse. It's not a quick process, but it's relentless. Look at history. What happened to America's industrial cities when manufacturing moved to China? Detroit, once a symbol of American prosperity, turned into a ghost town. Entire neighborhoods abandoned, houses crumbling, crime through the roof. People who worked in factories their entire lives found themselves useless. Their skills became obsolete. No new jobs existed. Hope disappeared. The same thing happened in Britain in the 80s when Margaret Thatcher shut down coal mines and steel mills. Entire regions never recovered from that blow. Now, Europe is following the same path. The only difference is the process is happening even faster and more painfully. Metallurgy is already practically dead. Steel production in Germany has declined by 30% over the last 2 years. 30%. This isn't a minor reduction. This is a collapse. Plants are closing not because there's no demand for steel, but because producing it in Europe has become economically unviable. It's cheaper to buy from China or India, even with shipping costs. The chemical industry is next in line. Fertilizer production, plastics, dyes, pharmaceuticals, all of this requires enormous amounts of energy. European chemical companies are already relocating production abroad. They're not announcing it loudly. They're doing it quietly, plant by plant. First, they freeze investments in Europe, then gradually move capacity out. In 5 years, European chemical industry will be a shadow of itself. The automotive sector is trying to survive by switching to electric vehicles, but there are problems here too. Battery production requires massive amounts of electricity. Europe doesn't produce most battery components. They come from China. European automakers are essentially becoming assembly shops for Chinese parts. This isn't the future politicians painted when they talked about the green transition. Now, here's the interesting part. While Europe voluntarily kills its industry, competitors are happily filling the vacant niches. China is increasing steel and aluminum production. India is building new chemical plants. America is luring European companies with subsidies and cheap gas. The whole world is watching what's happening and thinking, how could anyone be this stupid? European politicians say, we're transitioning to renewable energy sources, we're building wind farms and solar panels, we're creating the energy of the future. Sounds beautiful. But let's look at reality. Wind doesn't always blow. The sun doesn't shine 24/7. In winter, when energy demand is at its peak, solar panels operate at 20% capacity, and wind turbines often stand completely still due to lack of wind. Renewable energy cannot replace baseload generation. This is a fact acknowledged by all energy engineers, but stubbornly ignored by politicians. You need backup capacity for when there's no sun and no wind. And that backup capacity is gas, coal, or nuclear power. Europe is closing coal plants, refusing gas, and decommissioning nuclear power stations. What then fills the gaps in the energy system? Prayers. Germany has closed all its nuclear plants over the last 10 years. This was a political decision after the Fukushima accident in Japan. Germans got scared and decided nuclear power was too dangerous. But here's what they didn't consider. Nuclear plants provided stable, cheap, low-carbon electricity. Now they're gone. Instead, Germany burned coal and bought gas from Russia. And now, with no gas, what's left? Coal. The dirtiest energy source. So much for caring about the environment. France, by the way, was smarter. They kept their nuclear plants and are now exporting electricity to neighbors at astronomical prices. The French are making billions selling electricity to Germany, Italy, and Spain. The irony is that Germans rejected nuclear power on principle, but now they're buying nuclear electricity from the French. Principles are expensive. Industry won't return when energy prices stabilize. This is important to understand. When a factory closes, when production moves to another country, that decision is almost irreversible. You can't just snap your fingers and restore everything. Equipment gets dismantled or rusts. Skilled workers find other jobs or relocate. Supply chains get restructured. In 5 to 10 years, even if energy becomes cheap again, industry won't come back. It'll be in China, in India, in America. Europe will become a museum continent, beautiful but economically powerless. Now, the third part. Let's talk about people. About 450 million people who will wake up to a new reality. About how this decision, made in government offices, will change the life of every European. Because in the end, economics isn't charts and numbers. It's your paycheck, your heating, your food on the table. Let's start with the most obvious, heating. Most European homes are heated with gas. This is in California, where winter temperatures rarely drop below freezing. This is Central and Northern Europe, where winter means 10-20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, snow and freezing winds. When there isn't enough gas, people freeze. This isn't a metaphor, this is literal. Last winter in the United Kingdom, there were already cases of elderly people dying from hypothermia in their own homes. They couldn't afford heating bills and chose to sit in the cold. Bills tripled or quadrupled while pensions stayed the same. What do you choose? Heating or food? This isn't a choice people should have to make in the 21st century in one of the world's wealthiest regions, but they're making it. Every day. Governments promise subsidies, but subsidies don't solve the problem. They just transfer it. Money for subsidies comes from taxes or the printing press. If from taxes, you're still paying, just differently. If from printing money, inflation rises and your money loses value. Either way, ordinary people pay. Ordinary people always pay. Look at food prices. Over the last 2 years, prices in European supermarkets have risen 30 to 40%. Why? Because food production requires energy. Greenhouses are heated with gas. Fertilizers are made from gas. Transportation runs on fuel. When energy gets expensive, everything gets expensive. A box of pasta, a pound of meat, a gallon of milk. Everything becomes a luxury for low-income families. Spain and Greece are already recording rising poverty levels. People who used to be considered middle class are now struggling to make ends meet. They're economizing on everything. Food, clothing, entertainment, medicine. They're postponing doctor visits because they can't afford medications. They're giving up vacations, new shoes for their kids, everything that used to be taken for granted. Young people are losing prospects altogether. Jobs are becoming scarcer, especially in manufacturing, where you could traditionally earn good money without a college degree. Young people graduate from universities with diplomas but can't find work in their field. They work in cafes, in stores, in temporary positions with no growth prospects. They can't afford to buy an apartment or even rent their own place. They live with their parents until they're 30 or 40. This isn't living. This is surviving. And what happens when power outages start? Not if, but when, because the system is already operating at its limit. When demand exceeds supply, utility companies start implementing blackouts. First for industry, then for residents. You come home in the evening and there's no power. No electricity means no internet, no TV, no refrigerator. Food spoils. You can't charge your phone. This isn't some movie apocalypse. This is just the reality of countries where the power grid can't cope. And Europe is heading exactly there. Social tension is rising. Even now, protests are happening all across Europe. French yellow vests took to the streets precisely because of rising fuel and living costs. In Germany, there are worker strikes demanding wage increases to compensate for inflation. In Italy, the government changes every 2 years because none can handle the crisis. People are angry, they're scared, they're demanding solutions. But there are no solutions. Politicians do what they do best, make promises. They promise the crisis is temporary. They promise the future will be better. They promise green energy, prosperity, justice. But promises don't heat homes and don't fill refrigerators. Promises are just words, and people want action. The problem is there won't be action. Because real action requires admitting the decision was wrong. It requires admitting that cutting off Russian gas without real alternatives was an act of economic suicide. But politicians don't admit mistakes. They'll stubbornly stick to their course until the entire economy collapses completely. And then they'll say it was external circumstances, evil forces, anyone but themselves. This is a classic pattern. When leaders make ideological decisions instead of pragmatic ones, citizens always pay the price. Venezuela, once South America's wealthiest country, turned into ruins because leaders decided socialism was more important than economics. Zimbabwe destroyed its currency by printing money to cover insane spending. Argentina regularly declares defaults because it can't or won't conduct sound economic policy. Europe thinks it's different, that it's smarter, that this won't happen to them, but history doesn't forgive arrogance. Now let's wrap up and look at what can be done, what's really happening and where this is all heading. Because it's important not just to describe the problem, but to understand if there's a way out and what each person can do in this situation. Europe made a decision it can't back away from without completely losing face. Politicians have gone too far. They declared Russian gas unacceptable on moral grounds. They made this a battle of principles, not economics. And now they've painted themselves into a corner. Going back means admitting they sacrificed the well-being of 450 million people for ideology. Such an admission is politically impossible, so they'll continue. They'll print money to support the population. They'll subsidize industry that will leave anyway. They'll build terminals for liquefied natural gas and wind farms that won't solve the baseload generation problem. They'll pretend everything is under control until the system collapses completely. The only real solution is returning to pragmatic energy policy. This means using all available energy sources: gas, coal, nuclear, renewables. This means diversifying suppliers, but not refusing cheap sources for expensive ones purely for ideological reasons. This means acknowledging that energy security is more important than political gestures. But such acknowledgement won't happen anytime soon. Too much political capital is invested in the current course. Too many leaders built their careers on promises of green transition and standing up to Russia. They won't give this up until forced to. And they'll only be forced when the crisis becomes so deep it's impossible to ignore. What does this mean for ordinary people? It means you need to prepare for difficult times. This isn't fear-mongering. This is common sense. When you see the ship heading for an iceberg and the captain refuses to change course, you prepare a lifeboat. Practically, this means several things. First, manage your spending. If you have debts, especially with variable interest rates, try to eliminate them as quickly as possible. Inflation and rising interest rates will make servicing debt increasingly burdensome. Second, protect your savings. If your money is just sitting in a bank account in euros or dollars, it's losing value every day due to inflation. Consider diversifying into assets that hold value. Real estate if you can afford it, precious metals, stocks in stable companies. Third, invest in skills that will be in demand regardless of the economic situation. Repair work, construction, programming, healthcare. These are areas where specialists are always needed. If you work in an industry dependent on cheap energy, start thinking about retraining. Fourth, be prepared for disruptions. This might seem paranoid, but having a small supply of long-storage foods, candles, batteries, basic medications, this is just sensible precaution. When power or supply disruptions happen, those who are prepared weather them much more easily. Fifth, don't panic and don't lose your head. Crises aren't the end of the world. They're periods when the weak fail and the strong find opportunities. History shows that after every crisis comes recovery. Those who maintain clear thinking and act rationally emerge from crises stronger. And last, most important, don't believe politicians and media who say everything is fine or will be fine soon. Look at the facts. Look at the numbers. Energy prices don't lie. Factory closure rates don't lie. Inflation doesn't lie. When they tell you the crisis is temporary while prices keep rising year after year, that's not a temporary crisis. That's the new reality. Europe is experiencing one of the most serious economic crises in its post-war history. This isn't an exaggeration. The decision to abandon cheap energy without a real alternative triggered a chain reaction that's destroying industry, impoverishing the population, and undermining the foundations of European prosperity. And the saddest part, this was predictable. Economists warned, engineers warned, industrialists warned, but politicians decided they knew better. Now, 450 million Europeans are paying for that arrogance. They're paying with higher heating bills. They're paying with lost jobs. They're paying with declining living standards. They're paying with uncertainty about the future. And the most frustrating part, they didn't vote for this. This decision was made for them, in their name, but not in their interest. History will judge this period very harshly. Future generations will study this in textbooks as an example of how ideology defeated common sense, how short-term political gains were prioritized over long-term prosperity, how the wealthiest continent voluntarily chose the path of economic decline. But history is the future. We live in the present, and in the present we must be realists. We must see the situation as it is, not as we'd like it to be. We must make decisions based on facts, not hopes. We must protect ourselves and our families, because no one else will do it for us. The ship is heading for the iceberg. The captain refuses to change course. The passengers are starting to understand. The only question is, how many people will manage to prepare before impact? I hope this video helped you see the real picture. Share it with those who need to know this. Discuss it, think, act. Because the time when you could just hope everything would work itself out is over.